Hello and welcome to July's edition of What Has the Environment Ever Done for Us? It's been a really busy month this month politically, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time later on talking about some of that. We've had the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, we've had lots of discussion around the Climate Change Committee's report about adaptation and reduction of emissions. And so, as usual, we will be talking about the headlines later on in today's show. And we will be helped by that, by this marvelous group of individuals who are here to take you through it today. So you have me, Keith Mitchell, from Stantec. We don't have, unfortunately, Nick Kilby, who's decided that experiencing sun, sea and sky firsthand on the Dorset coast is more important than talking about the importance of sun, sea and sky here on What Has the Environment Ever Done for Us. It's obviously going to be very difficult to replace his easy charm and deft chairmanship. I'm sure we shall miss all that, but I will do my very best to fill a large pair of shoes. We are joined by the rest of our regular panel, Vicky Slade from Kratos, our political commentator and this month's interviewer, Johnny Riggle and Jenny Hughes from Stantec, who are expert panelists, and our fabulous guests this month, Josh Tregale, making his return to the show to talk about education, and Kate Sims, education consultant at the Education Development Trust. And we'll be exploring the importance of education in relation to the climate change agenda. And before we move on to Vicky, who's going to be conducting our interview today, I did just also want to mention that we've had a bit of a busy month for the Kratos team ourselves. We all got together in a very carefully choreographed attempt to explain why it is so important that you should be listening to What Has the Environment Ever Done for Us. And we were all 2 meters apart, being filmed on the banks of the River Thames. This is now up on our YouTube site, and I highly recommend it if you want a good laugh to see
at our expense.
At our expense. You really should go and have a look. It's quite funny. Anyway, you can look forward to that at another time, I'm sure. And it only now remains to me to pass it over to you, Vicky, for our interview on education in July's edition of What's the Environment Ever Done for Us?
Thank you, Keith, and I just want to say welcome back to Josh. Josh was living in Dorset last time we met him, and he's abandoned us and gone to St Albans, which is most frustrating, as I was planning on using him to deliver a few leaflets in the summer sun, but that won't be happening now. I shall have to send him elsewhere. But some of you may remember that we met Josh back in January after he had been highly involved with mock COP, with COP26 having been delayed last year. And at the time we said we would love to have Josh back and see whether the promises of 2021 and the run up to the actual COP in Glasgow had been fulfilled. So we're going to cover a few things about whether it's going to be a shining example of climate activism, or rather a damp Glasgow squib. And then Kate is bringing a slightly more international feel and dispelling a few of the myths about why it's important that we take a global look at education, and that we don't just say, well, all those people in Africa who are having 17 children, if they stopped having 17 children, we'd all be fine. And actually saying, well, maybe it's slightly more complicated than that. So I'm really excited to have both of you on, and hope we can do it justice. It does seem rather ironic that today is the first day of the school holidays and we're talking about education. But it is interesting that my youngest child said to me today that he was already bored and would rather be back at school. So maybe, we'll get him to tune into this, and it's like being back at school. So I want to start off asking Josh a couple of things about how 2021 has panned out so far, in terms of where we thought we might be. Obviously, Joe Biden's had his summit. We had the G7, you know, the Cornish chaos. And obviously, we're now less than 100 days from COP26. So do you think the world leaders have made enough progress so far? What's your feeling on it?
I think we're in a much better place than we were 6 months ago in terms of the progress that has been made and the potential that we see. Joe Biden's election has really showed a huge step change on the international stage, and hopefully the pressure that he's able to apply is really going to help other countries to up their ambition as well. I think for me, my hopes were higher than what I've seen happen. I was hopeful that that would signal a real change, other countries would really grasp on, and the UK would really push through and show huge leadership when it came to COP26 and issues surrounding that. And I think one of the key sticking points for me, with it being less than 100 days to COP now, is that one of the key things to talk about at COP will be that 100 billion a year, and will be all of the finance stuff associated with Paris Climate Agreement, with COP26. And it doesn't feel like there's been enough progress on that yet. When we had the Paris Climate Agreement back in 2015, there was a huge effort from loads of different countries, and France before that agreement came together. There was so much work done before COP happened, whereas I've not really noticed the same level now. And I guess part of that's probably because lots of governments are still really busy and focusing on the coronavirus pandemic and dealing with that and working out where they want to go with that. So they've almost had lots of different issues to contend with at once. But I think the result is that we're not quite in the position that I would have liked to have seen us be. I think 100 days, you can do a lot in 100 days. If there's a concerted effort, lots of those things could be addressed. And I'd really like to see that happen over the summer, when MPs typically go on recess and have a really long time off. I think if politicians continue to work then and pushed in those last 100 days, we could see some real changes. But so far, there's been quite a lot of talk, and then often opposite actions have happened. And I mean, in the UK, we've seen that with Cambo oil fields and some of these other decisions that governments have made. It's almost like one government department saying be more ambitious, and then another is showing exactly the opposite. And those sorts of mixed messages, I don't think are going to help the positions of different countries when we're trying to come together at COP26 to be ambitious.
What about Cornwall? Did you follow what was happening at Cornwall? That felt slightly strange with the red arrows going down. I mean, in fact, we did have that as our sort of hypocrisy of last month. I think it felt to me like Cornwall should have been the moment that we really saw a change, that it was on the news, that it was in our consciousness, and that hasn't really happened.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really liked about the G7 was that the G7's it's a conference where some of the largest economies talk to each other. It's not specifically a climate conference. And I'd actually really liked the way that whenever it was portrayed in the news and when people were talking about it, people quite often referred to it as a climate conference, because that was one of the key issues that was being discussed. And for me, that was a good signal that at least the public opinion, or the way the news were presenting it, was that climate change was really important, especially ahead of COP26. But I did feel like it was overshadowed by, it almost felt like the UK was trying to show that it could still host events, and it almost felt more like a party, like, oh, we're allowed to get back together, we're allowed to move between countries, let's just have a good fun time, and show that conferences still work in person, rather than we're actually going to go and do some really serious business. And it's hard because lots of stuff that happens at those conferences you never get to hear about. So there might have been some really great stuff that was talked about, we just don't know it happened. But to me, it still felt more like it was a show conference of, we're going to visit all of these different places, we'll do these different banquets, we'll have a barbecue on the beach, we'll have the red arrows, almost as if a sort of, this is how you run a conference, we'll show you how to have fun, sort of thing.
So obviously COP is very different. You know, COP is that much broader thing, as you say. G7's about 7 countries, or 7 countries in the EU, wasn't it? Whereas the COP is hopefully everybody, either physically or virtually. From what you've seen so far and what Alok Sharma has put out as the agenda, I mean, the agenda came out, was it 2 weeks ago? I thought that was really interesting. Agenda, particularly that whole day around sort of youth and community engagement. I thought that was a really positive step. Do you think that from what you've seen, COP is going to move us up a gear in every country? Do you get that sense?
I think we've seen good signs from countries that typically aren't so engaged in COP processes. We've had NDCs that have been produced or commitments that have been signalled from countries that are typically ones that slow things down, or countries that have historically struggled to be more ambitious because of the way economies are built. And it was really good to see the conversations happening between the US and China about emissions reductions, because typically those two countries struggle. They almost see it, I guess, as a sort of a threat to the way that they currently do business. Almost like if something happens to one of them, it's going to be a benefit to the other. So they both have to do stuff together. And it was nice to see that those sorts of conversations were potentially starting to happen. Yeah, COP26 is very different because it's all of the countries. And when you've got loads of people in a room, it makes it harder to agree on anything. And I think that's why it's so important to do work beforehand. And I think there is a willingness from countries to do the work beforehand. We've seen, even in Europe recently with the flooding, the impacts of climate change, they get more frequent and they get closer to home. And I think that given the amount of coverage that those floods got, because they were in Europe, we end up getting a disproportionate amount of coverage if something happens in the US or in Europe. And that was in Europe. There was so much news coverage of it. We even saw countries say that they weren't doing enough to tackle climate change or to be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, because they'd seen firsthand that the impacts weren't just affecting other people, it affected people close to home as well. And I think that those sorts of things, the way that public opinion is shifting so much and the way that it becomes in the news so much more than it used to. Political parties didn't used to have environmental stuff in manifestos in all of them as a sort of important aspect. And in the last election in the UK, we saw that in some way, almost every major party did talk about climate change. Some of them were very poor, others were pretty good, but it was something that was a theme throughout all of them. It's no longer something that you can't talk about. And I think we're seeing that happen in other countries as well, that it's something you have to talk about because the public want it.
So in terms of the profile of education on the COP agenda, are you satisfied that as far as COP is concerned, and we'll come on to the broader education agenda in a minute, but are you satisfied that it's got a high enough profile? Because it was in your mock COP declaration, climate education was that first thing that every country should be providing. Do you think it's got a high enough profile for Glasgow?
I don't, and I don't think we'll see any particularly good climate education outcomes from COP. The way that it works, that everybody has to agree on something, means that if one person says no, it's not going to form an official part of the agreement. And when you've got almost 200 countries, it doesn't take very much for one country to say no and for that not to be there. And there's not really a particularly solid platform for education reform to be built upon. We've got the Action for Climate Empowerment agenda, but lots of that's opt-in, or countries can self-assess whether they've met requirements. So almost every country could say, oh yeah, we've done it, without much justification because of the system that it's built on isn't particularly strong. So I think without more work being done on assessing whether countries have met educational standards when it comes to sustainability in the environment, I'm not very positive that COP26 will see big progress when it comes to that across the whole of the conference. It could work very well as a side thing that a large number of countries sign on to say, yes, we will do this. But I don't think it's going to form a part of the actual COP26 outcome. What
about you, Kate? Do you from what you've seen of the COP programme and your experience in the past, do you think COP is going to be that game changer on education?
I'm not sure if it would be a game changer, but it feels like it's the start of something that the recognition of the role that education can play and the role that gender equality can play in addressing climate change is something that certainly is new from my point of view, and it's now on the agenda, which I think has really been amplified through youth-led movements and protests around the need to act and holding the governments accountable for their policies around climate change. So yes, certainly from my point of view, it's great that it's on the agenda. and being recognised as something that, even if it's superficial, there needs to be an agreement around it.
Yeah. So Josh, just coming back to the sort of local, we read a few weeks ago in Scotland that children were apparently being taught about the benefits of climate change. I'm assuming they were talking about, you know, having a sunnier summer, but as we've all noticed, we can't handle it when the weather's nicer. So perhaps we're going off that idea. And I had a really good read through when we first put this together about, you know, just how much or how little climate change is actually on the national curriculum. In primary level, I mean, there's a couple of brief mentions within science, but it's not really there. What's your view about how much we need to put climate change into the everyday school curriculum? Because there's some other talk about refocusing the whole of education to sort of have this climate agenda running through it.
Yeah, I think other people would disagree with me on this, but I think it's really, really important that it goes throughout all of the aspects of education. I think when it gets put in just chemistry or just geography, you end up with a situation where I actually took sciences and I did geography, so I was we covered it a little bit. But if I was to be doing art and I was doing maths and I was doing music, for example, wouldn't have any talk of climate change throughout the subjects that I was doing. And then I could so easily dismiss it as that's a problem for scientists to deal with. I don't need to think about it because someone else is dealing with it, or that doesn't apply to me. And I think that's really dangerous, that sort of mindset of, oh, it's a problem for somebody else to tackle, because actually climate change is something that will universally affect everyone. And it doesn't necessarily impact everybody the same. We've already seen that certain countries get impacted considerably worse than others, and it's often the countries that have done the least to contribute to climate change that get hit the hardest, which is in itself hugely unjust. But I think it's dangerous for it to be siloed. And I think that even when it is taught at the moment in secondary education, I honestly can't remember what primary school was like, but it was quite a long time ago. But in secondary school, it wasn't taught thoroughly. We didn't learn about the impacts that climate change had. We didn't learn about how to stop it or what causes it. It was climate change is a thing. And quite often it's the way that it's taught in the national curriculum and the way that exam questions are worded around it. It does so that sort of how solid is this science? It's things like there's tiny percentage changes of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That just doesn't sound very important when you look at other numbers in science and huge numbers, and then you get these fractions of percentages that change. It doesn't make it sound particularly bad. You don't learn about the way that it actually affects people.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to Kate last week about this. We were talking about creating a bit of a narrative. And I've heard some criticism that we have a lot of films that have got this sort of apocalyptic and dystopian futures, and that's potentially quite dangerous because it carves out a bad guy that's never the normal person. I'm wondering about whether, you know, over time we're going to start seeing more literature and more art and things that have been inspired by this, and stories, because a lot of the crises are quite recent, aren't they? And I just wonder whether we just haven't had enough time to read those books. I'm a huge fan of books around history, and I've read about all different time periods, but there's not much out there at the moment about, you know, someone having to flee their country because of climate change. We might have heard about them having to flee because of war. So perhaps, do you think we might just be almost a bit ahead of our time in terms of how we put it into history and drama and things like that?
I think there's a potential that we are, but when it comes to education, you have to be ahead of time. If I was to be starting education now, it's going to be 5 to 10 years, maybe even 15 if I'm going to university, before I leave education. And in 15 years, if I've not done anything about climate change, that doesn't really prepare me for what the future is. 15 years from now, the hope is that we're going to be well on our way, if not already reached, a net zero economy. And if I've never learned about that or any of the things that come with it, it's not really going to help young people be part of that system. It's going to feel alien to them. And I think that the risk that we scare people or people get eco-anxiety from learning about climate change, I think there's a much higher risk that people read about climate change in the news. They see the floods in Germany, they see the droughts and heat waves in other countries, and they think, why is that happening? And then they see the link to climate change, but they've never been told about it in an environment at school where it's really safe to learn new things. It's a really well protected environment. There's staff there that can talk you through things and that can spot if you're concerned about stuff. If you end up learning about climate change and the impacts when you're on your own later and you don't understand it, I think there's a much higher risk there of feeling concerned or scared. Whereas if you learn it in an environment at school, which will then come with things like, but there are ways we can tackle it and there is still time, those sorts of things, you're much likely to be able to understand it and want to make a difference rather than just be panicked by seeing it in the news later.
Vicky,
both of you. Go on, Keith. Yeah.
would you mind if I just ask a question
No,
there,
not at
because it's
all.
particularly interesting. We're involved in some schools engagement work at the moment and looking to build an engagement program around climate change. And one of the bits of feedback that we've had from people we're working with are twofold, really. One is exactly the issue you've just been talking about, eco-anxiety, and that being a barrier to implementing anything like that cross-curriculum core skills within schools. And indeed, how that impacts on teaching staff who are pretty uncertain about how to go about educating in this area. And I mean, I know that you're, amongst many other things that you do, you're the international campaign coordinator at Teach the Future. I don't know if these are sort of part of your day-to-day conversations with educators and how to overcome some of those issues.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key issues that we face at the moment. When I've contacted MPs and colleagues and people that I've worked with have contacted MPs and asked about climate education and highlighted some of these things that I've mentioned, they often get the response, we don't need to make any changes because the national curriculum offers some flexibility for teachers to pick and choose and add extra context. But some of the research that Teach the Future did showed that almost all teachers didn't feel like they had enough understanding to add it comfortably into their lesson plans without fear of getting it wrong. And so when the training for teachers isn't adequate, they're not able to add it into the lessons. So even if they're allowed to, in theory, they won't, because unless it's something they understand, they're not supposed to. And I think as well, that teachers are all trained to look after students. We have tutors in school, with class of 30, because their classes are relatively big now, but they're there to look out for you. And we already learn about things that have a really damaging impact on people and health, like human rights abuses and all of these other things that we learn about and are really important to learn about. But it's a safe, protective environment. It's the sort of place that if you were to develop eco-anxiety or any of those underlying issues, it will get spotted really quickly, and there's so many things you can do to tackle those problems. So I feel like that's not necessarily going to be a problem in schools if teachers know the science and the sort of understanding of climate change to go alongside it.
And have you had discussions about, because I see this as one of the reasons why we were so keen to tackle education skills as a key part of this show, is that, I think we see that there's a responsibility on us as employers and people engaged in the planning and development system to be helping with some of this, because we can be talking about the things that you can do to help, the positive side of that equation. Is that also, does that get discussed with this, or is there a reluctance to allow, non-professional educators into that environment?
So I slightly missed the question there. Sorry.
Yeah, so I was just asking if your experience in discussing these issues with teachers, it reveals an uncertainty about letting employers into the classroom to help, because part of what we can be doing is talking about the things that you can be doing to help to tackle climate change, and the things that are actually happening on the ground, and things that students as they go into their careers can be doing.
I think teachers are really happy to have businesses and people from businesses in the classroom. I mean, I can't talk for all schools, but in my school, we had a B&E day, so we had to do like business and enterprise and those sorts of things, and we had local businesses come in and talk about what work was like for them. They would show us some of their projects. So I'm interested in engineering. That's where I'd like to go. I want to go into renewable energy, and some of the local engineering firms would come in and they would show us some of the diagrams and the drawings they're working on. We could ask them questions about how they got into their career, those sorts of things. And I think schools are really keen for that link, because actually schools are supposed to prepare you for life and for being able to get jobs, and it's more than just passing exams. And I think when there's opportunities to have those stronger links between employers and between those other skills that you don't pick up by doing the academic subjects, they're really keen for it. And even for our sort of like last week of term, we had people from the army come in, and we did activities with them, like running around the field and those sorts of things. So teachers are really happy for other people to, I guess, take workload off their plate, because they don't have to do as many lesson plans if someone else is there as well.
I wonder, sort of for both of you really, just before we move on to Kate and sort of bring the sort of helicopter vision up a little bit more, do you think there's a reluctance because climate change is seen as political? I mean, Josh already mentioned that you know, we're now seeing environmental things across political manifestos, and there is quite a polarized view, isn't there, still? I haven't quite broken through to it being mainstream, particularly across the generations. Is there an element of schools being nervous about being seen to be talking about something that could be deemed, perhaps by people outside of school, parents, grandparents, communities, as a bit political?
Well, and add on to that, Vicky, as well, just political, but also too big. I mean, the stuff that you were talking about there, Josh, about fitting in climate change to all parts of the education system, from art. You know, every revolution sees a renaissance. You know, if you look at previous industrial revolutions, even the last industrial revolution, it came with a renaissance in the arts and in culture as well. And those things are intrinsically interlinked. But that whole thinking is a really big thing to get one's head around. Does the education system itself, can it cope with the pace of this revolution that we need to go through in order to be able to deliver that renaissance in art and literature and so forth, which is all part of the education sector and learning and academia?
Do you want to go first, Kate?
Sure. I think there are some key changes that need to be made first before it can get to that point. Firstly, I think perhaps because, as Johnny, you say, there's so much content, and the links to each of the subject areas are so complex. I think it's part of a wider skills development, which can then be holistically applied across the curriculum, that empower children and young people to understand how to make fact from fiction, how to be able to use the resources that they have on their hand to learn more about areas of climate change that interest them, but also to learn about more that they can do as individuals and in their localized communities to make an impact on a global scale. But equally, as we've seen over the past year or so, that there are some teachers that really want to enable this through the School Strike for Climate, but put in a bit of a dilemma, because school attendance and exam marks on literacy or numeracy, that all sits on teachers as individuals. So it's a big ask, but certainly I think to enable that, a focus on 21st century skills, which is a term that's battered about a fair amount, problem solving, for example, and empowerment is how we do that. That doesn't answer your question, but some hopeful solutions.
No, but I think you're right in that it is so big. I mean, where do you start? Particularly if, and coming back to sort of that, sort of, is it political? Is if you work with a group of children to reduce the use of plastic, you know, and, you know, say we're not going to have plastic bottles in school, it's very easy to say, well, that's such a tiny drop in the ocean. Is it even worth bothering? So it can be undermined very easily. Whereas actually it's that incremental shift, isn't it? That is quite hard as a school to sort of say, well, we're going to do this bit, but actually you need the rest of society to also be doing their bit as well. Otherwise it looks like you're sitting out on a bit of a limb. So there is a difficulty there.
I think that makes, so what you said, Kate, makes complete sense. And that the concept of being skills to resolve a problem is encapsulates what's needed from the education system with climate change. I think at the moment, and Josh, I mean, closer to it than I am or was to it, I think the way climate change is taught at the moment, it's a subject. You know, you learn about carbon emissions and the carbon life cycle, and therefore climate change. What you're not taught is the mathematics of resolving a problem that relates to the equation of climate change, or how changing natural landscapes are going to affect the way we see our planet through art, and that's the bit that appears to be missing. It's a very at the moment, it's factually taught, isn't it, as opposed to it's a broader problem, holistic, the skills needed to deliver that. Is that right in summary?
Yeah, and I think when it is taught factually, it's not even sometimes taught with the actual facts. It's often, so as an example, it's really good practice to use the phrase correlation is not causation. That's just like any statistician would always say that if there's ever a trend line through a graph. And I did further stats at A level, and it was like the answer, you saw a graph, you put that, you'd get a mark. But the same thing happens in chemistry, and in chemistry we had the sort of those graphs that map carbon dioxide levels and then global temperature rise, and they used that graph to use the point correlation is not causation. And arguably they weren't saying climate change isn't real, but by using that as the example, it doesn't help. Like on the exam spec, there would have been a point, you have to make the point correlation is not causation because it's a scientific principle, but to apply it to the only one bit of context about climate change doesn't help. And then in that article that you'd mentioned, Vicky, about the benefits of climate change, even the negatives that Bite Size had used were things like a reduced skiing season in Scotland. Is that if that's really the only issue with climate change, there's almost not much point tackling it. But we all know that actually there's much more severe impacts, and that's why it's really important to tackle. So when the facts are sort of, they pick the facts that actually make them the least impact, even though it is factual, is not particularly accurate, or it doesn't give a very good picture.
That probably takes you back, doesn't it, to what you said before, before I bring Kate in, about teachers not having the opportunity for all of them to have that professional qualification about how you can link climate change at the right level. It's a bit like, you know, when people are frightened of sex education, well, you're not going to teach a 6 or 7-year-old the same level of sex education as you would a 15-year-old. So it's how do you introduce in a safe way to enable curiosity, but without giving people the wrong information. You know, we've been teaching sex education for 50 years and people understand it to a certain extent because it's part of our lives. But for teachers, this is new to a lot of them, and some of them may not really understand it themselves. So how do you then, you know, engage at the right level? So I think it does make it incredibly difficult. So I think anything that we can all do as parents, as employers, as educators, and as politicians to actually boost that is that what would your ask be of us in terms of trying to move this forward, whether it be parents, governors, or employers? What should we be saying to schools, in your opinion, or government?
Which one of us was that one for?
It was to you, Josh, and then I'm going to go to Kate.
Okay, cool. I'll start at the back of that list. I think government could have the most impact immediately with that. If they were to add it to the national curriculum, every exam board would have to update the spec that teachers teach, and there'd have to be resources that come along with it, which means teachers would have to learn about it, which means they'd then have to teach it because it would be on the exams. So there's then that massive incentive, because exam results drive the way that you get taught in education, which is not an ideal system, but it's the one we have at the moment. So the government could immediately make a pretty big impact on it by adding it to the national curriculum and providing teacher training for teachers so that they're able to cover these topics. I think when it comes to parents, I think making those links at home with homework, and one of the things that I was really lucky with was that my parents would always be really helpful when I had homework. If I was struggling with something, they wouldn't give me the answer, but they would show me a way to find the answer, or give context. And I think parents being able to link some of the stuff that people are learning to what's happening in the news and what's happening around them in that sort of supportive household setting where you're okay to learn things that are difficult. I'm aware that a household isn't always supportive for everyone, so that's not going to work all of the time. And I think for governors, they can push for schools to include this as extracurricular. In my school, we have PHSE days. We have like various days on the calendar that are blocked out. You don't have lessons, you do something different for a bit to sort of break up the school week or the school year. And if you were to do environmental stuff on them or on part of them, or to learn about, for example, why school strikes are happening, if some of your class aren't in, to do a day about why are some of your class not here, I think that sort of pressure could be applied by governors or by parents, or in fact by students, and teachers could probably do that as well, to say, actually, this is why people aren't in, or we're going to do a half day here where we're going to learn about deforestation or something, or we're going to watch Blue Planet, or those sorts of things. And actually my tutor did that during tutor time, would watch Blue Planet or other snippets of the news that are on at the time. And teachers, the government have said that you've got flexibility to add sort of extra context to different things. So adding context to current events that we might see in the news about climate change, that can have a real impact as well with how students then perceive the links between the real world and what they're taught. So I think there's lots of different ways. I think the easiest is probably for the government to make a change, and then it would have to happen. The others are quite hard because you have to do lots of research yourself or motivate yourself to do particular things. And it's going to be on a much smaller scale because it's going to be per school or per family or per class. But there are lots of different ways.
To Kate, obviously you look at from a much more global perspective. I mean, it's very easy, isn't it, for us to say, well, we can sit down and we can help our children with our homework. But if you're a child that doesn't have access to secondary education, or you're spending your time having to go and fetch water and keep the electricity going, feed the fire, and whatever, it's a very different environment. But you're much more closely affected by those climate changes. That must be an incredibly frightening environment to say, well, actually, yeah, we're learning about climate change, but we're firefighting just to keep going. How do you teach in an environment where you are almost the subject?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and I think actually it's a question that the wider education community is still quite trying to grapple, quite honestly, especially navigating the challenges that you sit down with an education minister in a low-income country and you say to the education minister, listen, we need to embed climate change education into your national curricula. And the education minister says, in response, but, access, quality, and equity are still basic things that the education system in general is yet to achieve. What's that priority when basic literacy and numeracy standards still aren't achieved by the time that kids leave school after primary education? I think, however, there are some real practical ways, but that focus more on our adaptation and resilience rather than mitigation. Though from conversations that I've had through work, by introducing it as a resilience tool and an adaptation tool, it can then progress and slowly evolve into supporting learning around mitigation more generally, and it's something that I think there's potential across all areas of the education system, from early childhood development, supporting learning through play with natural resources, to tertiary and vocational education about how do you teach young people who are about to enter the labour markets around what green skills mean. What does green skills mean for a builder? But actually, in terms of vocational education, that seems to be the place where there's being more progress made on a global level.
So what is there actually a link? So I mentioned at the beginning about this sort of what you might hear from perhaps people who aren't completely convinced by climate change and want to sort of blame everybody else. that the way to sort out climate change is to reduce the population in developing countries. Clearly, that is an incredibly simplistic point of view, because our climate cost per head is much, much higher than people in developing countries. Is there a link between education of children, secondary education, particularly girls, and minimising climate change? Is there any link at all?
There are a lot of people that say there is a very strong link. However, I think as you say, it's presented far too simplistically, and the links and the complexities between each of those stages of those processes are still, so much more research is needed to actually fully understand them. And as you say, I think it's quite risky, because from somebody that sits in a high income country that typically emits more than an individual in a low income country, it focuses the attention on the number of emitters rather than the pattern of emissions. If you think about education as well, it places a really large burden on education to fix climate change. And although I am a strong believer that education is the solution to many of the world's problems, there are so many things beyond control of education in terms of determining fertility, for example, gender equality, individual girls' circumstances in her country. But then also the link between population and demography, from what I understand, and greenhouse gas emissions is quite contested. So in short, I think it's simplistic, and I think it's dangerous, and it's a slightly dangerous rhetoric. However, there's certainly a lot more evidence around the link that education plays in strengthening gender equality, which then reduces the impact of climate change disasters and strengthens the resilience of communities. And this can be introduced, I suppose, in different ways. It could be teaching kids and girls how to swim, has been introduced in some countries that are low-lying and susceptible to flooding, which results in mortalities from drowning. Teaching kids how to swim in their local rivers that are cordoned off by bamboo, I think, is a really creative solution to address that problem. But also, for example, in early childhood development, teaching songs or games that are friendly, that don't create that eco-anxiety, about what to do in the event of an earthquake, or either, I know that's not climate change related, but in terms of environmental impacts, or what to do in the event of floods. So there's a lot of creativity that doesn't require huge amounts of innovation to build that resilience, further supported by education that reduces gender equality in communities.
So is there a risk then? So I'm being very controversial here, so I'm not saying what I believe. I just want to clarify that in case anybody wants to throw this one at me. But if we educate a population more, and they are then a higher educated population, is there not a greater desire then for that population to live in a less sustainable way, because they see the way that we're living in the Western world, which is clearly unsustainable? Is there a risk around that, and how do we mitigate that risk so that as we educate and give everyone those same opportunities, they don't make the same mistakes we have in overconsumption?
There is a risk, especially if you look at patterns from the West and high income countries, as you say. But education is a fundamental human right. So there's no disputing that in my opinion. Instead, I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier around empowerment and skills development. This, I think, applies actually across all contexts, rather than lower middle income contexts where climate change education isn't as far on the agenda, even though Josh would probably disagree with me slightly from what he said earlier, than what it is now. how can we be more local in our thinking and act global, and what are the differences between the local level and the global level? Skills to support the and to mitigate the impact of climate change is all tied in. And so of course it's a risk, but there are ways to overcome it through that skills empowerment.
So it's quite interesting. Can I just go back to something Josh said earlier on, because it's quite interesting that you've talked about the fact that in a lot of these countries, numeracy and literacy is something that they don't have. So whilst the mock COP declarations that have asked everybody to make this commitment around climate literacy and climate education, actually there is potentially a really good reason why some countries might say, well, no, because actually we've got to prioritize can we read and can we actually keep ourselves safe? And so there might be a legitimate reason for not signing up to that. So I wonder whether, to go back to Josh, whether the question is right.
Yeah, I think climate literacy changes based on which country you're in. So in the UK, the focus that I would like to see it have is the holistic view that I've talked about of like, what causes climate change, what is climate change, how can we stop it, and what are the impacts? So that would be the sort of the full picture, because the UK is one of the higher emitting countries in the world compared to lots of other countries. So for us, it really should be, we should be leading the way really to illustrate that actually it's possible. We should be sort of paving the way for lots of other countries to follow, given our enormous historic emissions and the way that we sort of now enforce rules that didn't apply to us when we were like irresponsibly developing without sort of looking after the environment or in fact the people at the time. And for other countries, it's about climate resilience. They're already seeing firsthand the impact of climate change, so it almost changes, it becomes health education or survival education. It's about actually climate change changes the cycle of weather, so crops have to be planted at different times, or more crops will have to be planted because less will survive, or those sorts of things, or this is how you survive a typhoon or an earthquake. Well, actually, I don't know why I keep saying earthquake. That's not caused by climate change, but yeah, like hurricane or something. So it almost changes. The focus might not be what do we need to do to tackle it, but how do we survive the impacts of it. And later, when literacy and when numeracy develop more, then it's a good time for that to come in. But I think climate literacy does vary based on what the circumstance of each country and educator is.
I'm going to pass back to you. I know you had a question, and then I think we need to wrap it up.
Yep, I was just going to do exactly that. Thanks very much, Vicky. And it just occurred to me at that last point that we were discussing that a critical role of climate education has got to be to help people make better choices as global citizens. So, and those choices might be different depending on where they are. And the international perspective is important because that nuance enables us to reach some sort of global agreement about how that might be done. Is that how we see us getting through the COP26 dichotomy of whether or not we can agree something more globally about how to do climate education? Kate, I don't know if you've got a thought on that.
Yeah, I think though, because of the dilemma that I discussed earlier, I think it needs to be more presented in how can climate change education help you to adapt and also make better choices when you are adapting to the effects of climate change and environmental degradation. Certainly for low and middle income countries that aren't seeing the direct effects yet on the impact of climate change, it's not on their priority list, but to highlight the importance that this is coming, change is occurring, extreme weather is becoming a lot more unpredictable. This is how education can help you. A commitment on that, I think, is probably a lot more achievable than how can education change behavior. It is still changing behavior, but it's just presented in that subtle difference that I hope will receive political commitment.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed, Josh and Kate and Vicky, for a really interesting conversation around education. And one of the reasons I was just asking about that, how do we help young people make better decisions from a climate perspective, is that in thinking about this month's headlines, the big headline for me was the publication of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan by Her Majesty's Government in the UK. So this is very relevant from a developed country perspective. And transport and travel generally is a choice, isn't it? It depends on where we go to work. How do we want to go to work? Do we want to fly? Do we want to go on holiday to Portugal or to Tenerife? Do we need to buy a new vehicle? Or are we going to go on our bikes? All of these are choices, and ultimately, people who live in this country make those choices depending on the information that they're given to help them make those choices. So I think education has a massive role to play in that context, and probably even more so when you look at the content of the decarbonisation plan. We've been waiting for this for quite a long time. Transport is the largest, highest emitting sector left here in the UK. And we have received a suitably ambitious plan, which has broadly, I think, been welcomed. But there is a sense of disquiet about the tone and detail of the proposals, because just bear in mind now that conversation we just had about choices. Grant Shapps' introduction to this plan says the Transport Decarbonisation Plan published today is the first in the world. It's not about stopping people doing things. It's about doing the same things differently. We will still fly on holiday, but in more efficient aircraft using sustainable fuel. We will still drive on improved roads, but increasingly in zero-emission cars. We will still have new development, but it won't force us into high carbon lifestyles. And that tone, I think, is the tone that is sort of setting some of the academic and professional teeth on edge a little bit. Now, it's good to have a plan. It's a great place to start, and we can start then sort of trying to tackle some of the inconsistencies in it. The trouble is with the way that the plan is developed is that consumption is actually important. And if you recall, in our transport focused show, we had Professor Greg Marsden on, who talked about his work with the Decarbonate network. And if you're interested in this area at all, a really good source to get a very quick introduction into what the decarbonisation plan says has been published by his group. It's been written by Christina Shields, and it's called The Decarbonisation Island Discs. And it goes through 8 songs. If you're a fan of that show, then this is an absolute must. It goes through 8 songs and titles, and it uses those as a way of explaining what's in the decarbonisation plan. And the basic themes are: it's not enough. It tries to have its cake and eat it. You can keep on flying to Tenerife, but actually we've all got to stop driving. And actually, once you sort of start burying into the detail of the plan, it starts then talking about demand management and behaviour changes in ways in which we might need to do those in urban environments, but seems to fail to tackle some of the big issues. And as the Decarbonate Network say in their paper, that reduction in overall demand is going to be critical. Now, it also fails to tackle some of the other big issues out there. It hasn't tackled the issue of the roads investment strategy and the £27 billion worth of investment in roads. I'm sure the Secretary of State didn't want that to be the headline, But it has instead launched a review of the national network's national policy statement. And in fact, there is a review of all of the national policy statements going on, with, very importantly, a cross-departmental approach to that, because not only is decarbonisation of transport really important, the decarbonisation of our energy networks is absolutely fundamental, because the decarbonisation of the grid is the underpinning requirement of decarbonisation of transport. I can see Johnny laughing at that one, but that's absolutely true. So that's one of the areas that needs to be tackled. And the second area that needs to be tackled really is economics. Economics is going to be absolutely key. The tax system is going to need to be reinvented around the need to change the way we travel. And there's quite a lot of progress that needs to be made in that area. And last but not least, and this is for you, Vicky, local leadership is identified as critical to make changes in travel locally, in an environment, of course, when the level of direct local authority grants has almost halved in the last few years. And we're in a period of having massive debt and an inability to raise significant capital to address this particular issue.
I know we're very limited for time, but I must just share a real dichotomy that I'm involved with at the moment in my own area, where we have a campaign group that is now taking the council to a judicial review over the council's decision to reopen a road to traffic that had been closed last year. And we have a real dilemma. I mean, I've donated to the crowdfunding and, you know, I'm absolutely behind them. But if we win, and the council fight this and we win, then the council will have to pay out tens of thousands of costs. So it's a lose-lose for the council. So I'm really struggling here with that sort of, council fighting public to reopen the roads. But if council lose, council's going to have to open it and have a big bill to the public. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it, really? So yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Difficult times.
Yeah, difficult times and very active. So Jenny, you were just going to very quickly, I think, talk about some of the headlines, and then we'll do heroes and hypocrites in 1 minute each. How's that? Jenny, over to you.
So incredibly quickly then, because very helpfully, both Josh and Kate have both talked about climate change impacts. And in recent months, in general, across the sort of political spectrum and in the news, there's been increasing scrutiny in relation to climate change impacts, what we're seeing here in the UK even as well. So last week, Met Office issued their first ever extreme heat warning for the UK. We've had all sorts of news across the globe, including heat waves in Canada, deadly floods in Germany, China, Russia, storms, wildfires, droughts. And this just gives me the opportunity to nod back to the Committee on Climate Change and their independent assessment of UK climate risk last month. The reason I'm mentioning it here in the headlines is we're still seeing a big gap in policy in relation to adaptation, and a lot more is needed. The other thing I would just say is it shouldn't need to happen to us for it to be important and for it to matter. But I think there'll be a lot of people here in the UK realizing after last week and the impact of sitting in your home and the overheating. That's it in 1 minute.
That's just to add to that, Jenny, it's the dichotomy between policies that are all about mitigation, which actually impact adaptation issues, and they're not thought through properly, and therefore they're conflicting now with local policies driving mitigation that impacts risks associated with that, especially building.
Johnny, it seems to me like we could have a whole show on dichotomies in climate change, but instead we're going to go to Vicky to talk about heroes.
No, I'm not talking about heroes. I'm talking about anti-heroes. I'm talking about the villains.
We were talking about the villains.
I was trying to avoid using the word hypocrite because I've got into trouble. But it's got to be the billionaire space travelers, hasn't it? There is a complete irony that while the world is flooding and burning and everything else, these billionaires are sending their space phallic symbols of space rockets up into the sky. Honestly, it's just a joke. And my own youngest child said to me, Mummy, the world is burning and they're going into space. The worst part about this, and I could go on about it forever and I can't, is one of the things which Mr. Bezos has said is that one of the reasons that he's doing this investigation and trying to get this stuff into space is so that we can send all the heavy polluting stuff into space. Not content with destroying our planet, he wants to go and destroy space. So I really am going to have to reconsider my feelings about the place where I do my online shopping.
Yeah. Okay. On the plus side, and Kate very kindly pointed this out, so I'm going to pass this over to Kate. Well, we've got rich billionaires flying into space. We've got a young chap called Jude from Hebden Bridge. Kate, tell us a little bit more about Jude and what he...
Yes, Jude is 11 years old and, fitting with the topic today of education, has decided to walk 200 miles from Yorkshire to Westminster to raise awareness of climate change. And when he gets to Westminster, is urging a petition on a parliamentary debate on carbon tax. So I think it highlights how incredible young people are on raising this agenda and holding our governments and the elder generations to account. So well done, Jude.
So Jude is our hero of the month.
Fantastic. And I think on that note, we can happily close the sentiment of congratulating and wanting our young people, holding us all to account, with Josh on the programme, who's been doing exactly that. We can only say keep on the good work, and we look forward to seeing everybody next month when we'll tackle another interesting subject of climate change. Thank you very much indeed. See you all soon. Bye.